One of the ways that we can put patterns onto metal is by pressing it through a rolling mill. So to do that, you make a steel die that's on a flat sheet of metal that can be fed into the rolling mill. And turns out, of course, since the F1 laser from xTool has an infrared laser, we can use it to engrave shallow designs into a piece of steel and make a pattern plate. So today what I'm going to do is just show you how I make pattern plates. This is one that's very simple. It's a Celtic knot ring band, and I'll be showing you how to put together a very pretty band from this pattern plate that I cut with this laser. Pattern plates have been around for a very long time. They're a wonderful way and a very economical way to make patterns in metal. I have dozens of pattern plates. I recommend that you look around and you think about purchasing some. They're very nice to use, easy to use. Again, I get most of mine, frankly, from the Potter Company. But there are a couple of other places you can get them. You can also use etching to etch steel and make your own pattern plates, because it turns out that they work best when they're pretty shallow. You really don't want a very deep engrave in a pattern plate to make a nice impression. So with that, I hope you enjoy working through this with me, and we'll make this pretty ring. Here we are in xTool's creative space again, and I've simply imported an image that I first created in Procreate, and I inverted it already and cropped it. So I've got it set so that this is a black and white high definition, high contrast image. And what that means though is when I emboss this, remember to emboss it, you go over here and select embossment as one of the choices from that list. When I'm going to emboss this or engrave it into this piece of 1/8 inch thick mild steel that I'll use as a rolling mill pattern plate, which is another relatively easy way to make really nice patterns without a hydraulic press. Anyway, so what we've done here is create this Celtic knot pattern, and although if you're going to emboss, it's recommended that you use a depth map, but you don't have to. But if you don't, you need to realize that the cuts are going to be quite sharp, and they're not going to be angled. So you don't want this to be very deep, because otherwise it would trap your metal when you squished it in there. So rolling mill pattern plates tend to work best when they're actually a little thinner or not as deep as you might intuitively think. So we're going to go a little light on this one. So let's see. So first what I want to do now is select this autofocus and make sure that that's looking good. Yep, about 2.7. That's pretty close. It's almost 3 millimeters. Refresh it again just to be sure. And then I'm going to go ahead and frame it. Okay. So again, even though it is a rectangle, I'm still going to do this. So now we will quit framing, stop the framing, and we'll go ahead and see what we can do for setting this up. Alrighty, so we want to make sure, again, we select the fiber. We don't want this as deep because it's black and white, so I'm going to set this at 125, half of this, and see what that does for us. We'll go to 100% power, and also I don't want it that deep, so let's go to 500 millimeters per second, and we'll do 260 in terms of the resolution, because there's really not grayscale here. It's black and white. We'll leave the frequency at 30. Let's go ahead and see how long that's going to take, because it's a fairly long piece. So we'll hit the preview, calculate it. Not bad. It's about an hour. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll see how it goes. So we're going to go ahead and see if we can roll this pattern that we just cut into a steel plate in the rolling mill. So what we're going to do is take a piece of silver. This is sterling silver, 5 millimeters wide, it's 16 gauge. It actually started out 2 millimeters, but I rolled it to 16 gauge, which I like for this kind of a ring band. And you could do it with wider metal, and it just means more trimming, but that's okay, whatever floats your boat. Okay, so what I'm going to do is line this up, and I learned this technique from Kevin Potter, so I can't claim to have come up with it, but it works really, really well. Kevin Potter, Potter Company is also where I get many of my dies and rolling plates and in fact even the steel to make these things. Anyway, what you do is you need to back off your rolls so that you can fit this whole thing in like a sandwich, and then you tighten it down. Okay, so now it's tight, I cannot remove it. Now what I want to do is then that sets the base thickness. I know that I'm going to want to push the metal in about another couple thousandths of an inch at least, so you know, probably 2/10 of a millimeter or so. So what I'm going to need to do is I need to pull this out, but I'm going to do it by just going backwards 1/2 of a turn. I can pull it out. Now I'm going to go back 1/2 of a turn, and that puts it back into the register where it would grab, but it would be not pushing any metal down. So in order to push metal down, I'm going to turn this another 1/3 to 1/2 a turn. And again, each rolling mill will be a little different. You have to adjust it according to the ratio of your gearing, but for my mill that works out really well usually. Okay, then I'm going to put this in and begin rolling it, and you should feel a little bit of a tightness. Yeah, so it should be a little bit difficult, but not crazy difficult. There we go. Let's see what we did. That looks really quite nice. So again, what I'll have to do now is neaten up the edges, straighten everything, trim it, and build a ring band. That's actually kind of pretty, isn't it? Well, this kind of a clamp comes in mighty handy for doing jobs like this, where you need to hold the metal and file it to shape. So I'm just getting this to where I like it. Let's turn it over. Do a little more on the other side. Okay, so I did a little bit of filing on this off camera, but not much. So now what we want to do is chamfer the back edge, because that'll get sharp on you. And we want it to be comfortable when somebody's wearing it anyway. Okay, so yeah, there we have a beginnings of a band. To approximate a size 8, for example, I'd want it to be, for this thickness, I'd want it to be about 60 millimeters, 59.5 maybe. And what we're going to want to do, of course, is to match our pattern at least reasonably well. So I'm just going to line it up so that I see that 59 is right in the middle of a repeat here. Sure, yeah. So 59 is in the middle of a repeat, right there. And so what I want to do now is cut it as close to that as I can get away with for the middle of the repeat. And we're going to do that here too. So I'm just marking so that I may be able to match up the pattern when I cut it. Alrighty. And then I'm just going to cut it to size approximately. I'll be tightening these cuts up in a few minutes. There's a bunch of different ways to make these things. This is just the way I tend to do it. So I'm just going to they're not bad. They're almost always going to need to be trued up with a file. You know, there are jigs that allow you to cut things at very, very tight right angles or 45s, but I find I can do pretty well freehand most of the time. Okay, so I want to clean up that edge and then clean up this edge. Gotcha. Now, if this was a heavier silver band, I have a device, again, I bought it from, or got it from Kevin Potter, that bends bracelets and heavy bands. This is a very lightweight band. It's less than 2 millimeters. So I could do this by hand, or these come in very handy. They're just fairly simple nylon jaw pliers that allow you to begin shaping a ring. And it just makes your life a little easier. So for a couple of bucks, I'm all about working smarter, not harder. Alrighty. Now, the next thing you want to do is bring the ends of this ring close together what I like to do is make it like a D, so that it's rounded here and more straight where the join is going to be. So for this, I'm going to use a pair of half-round pliers. These are made specifically to bend this kind of a shape, so that you put the rounded part on the inside, and if you don't slip or really cream down on them, it doesn't mar the metal. So what I'm going to do is start about there and start putting a little bend in it, because I'm going to want them to come together with a fairly tight fit. You can see that. Let's do it one more time, at least. Yeah, I think one more. Yeah, I think once again. Pretty close. We're close, but not just there yet. But almost. That's pretty good, but not quite. There. So that's pretty good. Now, if you look closely, the pattern is almost perfectly lined up, and that's because we planned it that way. But the other thing that almost every jeweler I'm aware of does to clean these up is you take the saw, and now you run it back through. It's amazing how much this does. You just run the saw. If they are tight together, you run the saw blade right back through, being careful not to aim at your finger on the other side. And that gives it typically about as perfect of a joint as you're going to get with handmade things. Okay, so then the trick is to get your saw blade back out of there. There we go. And it might be just adjusted just a hair, but that is really, really very nice. Okay, our next step is going to be just to put a little bit of solder on that join and flow it in to make a ring band. So what we're going to do, I've secured the ring. It's very loose in there, but I'm now going to take some of my borax in water and make sure that I flood the join, because again, I want to, this is called flux, and I want to be able to absorb the oxygen before it has a chance to combine with the hot silver, because that would prevent the melding of the metals at that joint. I have a small pallion of hard solder, which again is about almost 80% silver, copper, and a little bit of zinc. So it has a slightly lower melting temperature than the sterling silver of the ring. And we're going to heat this up. There, we've got to make sure that the borax is there. I'm going to pick up a little pallion of solder with my tungsten pick. Place it on the join and be ready to move it around just a little bit, because oftentimes one side will get hot a little bit before the other, and the solder will try to run to the hottest part. Okay, make sure it's completely in and we're good to go. There's a temptation to use too much solder. Don't. It just makes a mess. It'll flow onto the other side and get into your design. So that you really don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do, remember this is hot, I'm going to now place this in the acidic pickle and then neutralize it and then rinse it with water, and we will then make it round. Now, in preparation of rounding this, I want to go ahead and smooth out the inside join just a little bit, because that's where you're going to have some solder imperfections. And I don't want that to bump up against my mandrel and cause a bump on the ring. So I'm not going to finish it, but I want to get rid of that little bump. This is also a good time to adjust any where it wasn't quite flat. You might be off by a 1/10 of a millimeter or so. I almost never get it perfect on the first shot, but it's good to get it as close as you can. But this helps you with your finished ring. Okay, now there will be a lot more finishing to do, but I feel comfortable rounding, well, almost. Let me check. I can do a little better there. This is a number 4 file, by the way, which is pretty fine. It's not polish fine, but it's pretty fine. It needs just a little polish after this. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now the traditional way, which I use as well most of the time, is to take a ring mandrel, which is a solid steel, typically, tapered mandrel, and it will almost always have the sizes, mine are in the US obviously, because that's where I'm located, along this. And you put the ring on there, and of course it doesn't come close because it's not round. So you take a rubber hammer, or a leather hammer in this case. This is just a leather mallet. And I start hitting it to remove the bits that are not round. There we go. Yeah. Okay, so now it actually is quite round. It's almost perfect. And next thing I'm going to do, though, is show you what I would want to do. This turned out to be a size 7. Let's say I wanted it closer to a 7.5, which is pretty much the average women's or female's ring size, depending on finger, obviously, but in the U.S. So let me show you what you can do to expand this. Now, depending upon the thickness of your metal, You can almost always go up or down in a size to a half size to a full size. This one I'd be comfortable with a half size going up. So what I do is put it on this part of what's called a ring stretcher, and what that allows me to do is push a cylinder up there that's tapered, and it stretches the metal. Now I've annealed it again so that it was soft. If it's brittle, it won't work. The other reason I like to do this, even if I'm not aiming to increase the size, I like to make sure that my solder joint is really tight. Because if it isn't for some reason, if there's been a little oxidation that's crept into your solder joint, and you do this, it will just snap. It'll open up on you. And you'd rather have that happen in the studio than after someone has paid money for a piece. Okay, so it's just sort of a quality control thing too. Now, this lower part, I won't show that to you right now, but that's if you wanted to make this smaller. You can actually put it in these tapered holes here and push it in, and it will compress the ring on both sides this way to make it a little smaller. So those are just a couple of quick and dirty things that you can do to accommodate variations in size. Now before I polish this, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of detail work where the join is, because it's inevitable that there's some solder that gets in there. You can put material in there to prevent solder flow, but frankly it's typically not that hard. So I'm going to use a little tiny burr and I'm just cleaning up There we go. It's not too bad. So the rest of this will polish down. I'm using I think that's a 1/4, it might be a 1/2 millimeter burr bit, ball burr, but it might be a 1/4 millimeter. I don't know which. It's just high-speed steel. Nothing special. Okay, so now it's time for me to go ahead and start polishing. And I like to do both the inside, the outside, and the sides. And I'll use these bristle discs to do that. A little extra attention to where the joint is. Okay, that was the last one. Most of the time, if you want to leave it bright, you can get away with that. That's, I think, a 14,000 grit wheel, so you really don't need compound to brighten these, and that looks really, really nice. So you could leave it bright, and I often leave rings bright, but I'm going to go ahead and oxidize this just to bring out the pattern that we spent time making with our pattern plate.